Hello, welcome back to those that joined us for the first session, and welcome if you're just joining us now. This panel is titled, Is Parliament Able to Fulfil its Constitutional Role? If you're just joining us, I'm Jess Sargeant, Associate Director at the Institute for Government. Parliament is at the centre of the UK Constitution, passing law, representing citizens and holding the government to account. However, the government's strong control of the House of Commons and the issues around the democratic legitimacy of the House of Lords have raised questions about whether Parliament is an effective check on the executive. Joining me to discuss this question, I have an excellent panel. We have Sir David Lidington, a former Conservative MP who's held a wide range of ministerial posts, including Leader of the House of Commons and Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, and also a member of the Review's Advisory Board. Baroness Smith is Shadow Leader of the House of Lords. She was a Member of Parliament between 1997 and 2010 and served as a Minister under both Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, and is also a member of our advisory panel. Lord Wallace of Saltaire is the Liberal Democrats' Lord's spokesperson for the Cabinet Office. In the 2010 to 2015 coalition government, he was a Government Whip and Lords Minister for the Cabinet Office. And Dr. Hannah White is the Director of the Institute for Government and author of Held in Contempt, What's Wrong with the House of Commons. So as a reminder, we will be live tweeting from @IFG events using the hashtag IFGBennetinst. Please follow and tweet along. And we'll also be asking questions to the panel from both the audience online and in person. If you're online, you can ask questions via Slido, which will be at the side of the screen which you're watching at. So let's start with what's the problem? Is there a problem? David, starting with you, given your extensive experience in the House of Lords, how much do you think MPs... Commons. Sorry, House of Commons. That was what I had written down. How much do you think MPs think about the Constitution?
Pretty little. I mean, once you're elected as a new MP, you are completely inundated, even more these days than when I was first elected back in 1992, by the sheer quantity of stuff that's thrown at you. I mean, MPs now get, it's a minimum of a few hundred, sometimes thousands of emails a day. A lot of them are circulars from various organisations. A lot of them are identically worded campaign emails from various groups or other, may or may not be from constituents. And then because MPs of all parties, I think, have focused a lot more on the constituency role than used to be the case, they don't, in my judgment, all or most even, spend enough time focusing on holding the government to account by scrutinising legislation of the day. You add into that what I think is excessive power of the executive compared with the legislature, so too often, and the reality of party loyalties, and too often the House of Commons can become a legislative sausage machine for, particularly when it's a government with a large majority. And I remember seeing this, and I saw it under Tony Blair's government. I'm sure that there have been occasions under the Johnson government when legislation that clearly had all sorts of unintended consequences was introduced in the Commons, not properly thought out, and it was almost completely rewritten when it came to the House of Lords. Yep. Just to get it right, technically. Leave aside the politics or the objectives of it. So adding that, I'll stop there, but adding to that, we haven't worked out what the role of the upper house should be. My view is that the current system for the House of Lords is not something that is defensible in a modern democracy, not to denigrate the work that William and Andrew and lots of other peers do, but a combination of a few ancestral rights and lots of prime ministerial patronage from both big parties, and but we've never defined what the powers should be, what the extent to which the Lords or replacement members should have a mandate for checking or even reversing what's in the Commons. This is why I've always voted for an elected upper house. But so I think for a number of counts, I think Parliament is not doing its job adequately, and which makes the sort of ideas that the Institute and report, the Bennett Institute are bringing forward are very timely indeed.
Thank you. And thanks for the plug. We always appreciate that. Angela, so having served in both the House of Commons and the House of Lords, what do you think makes the difference to how well members are able to perform that scrutiny function? What is it about the role of those two different chambers that results in quite different outputs on legislation?
I think David partly answered some of it when he said about the role of MPs and the workload.
Yeah.
I was an MP for 13 years. I went in just after David in 1997. And I used to say that my work was in thirds. They weren't equal thirds, but a third was an advocate for my constituency. Another third was the casework for your constituency. And that should inform the third part of your work in Parliament. And you found the parliamentary time, if you let it, get increasingly squeezed, and people would say, well, I haven't got time to come to the chamber for a debate, I'm doing my casework. And that's not sustainable. So I think workload plays a part, whereas in the Lords, that's our focus. And I slightly disagree when you say we've not defined the Lords' powers. I think we pretty much have, and you and I would call a conversation on statutory instruments, which we may share if anyone's nerdy as we are to have this conversation at some point, when David was leader and I was leader. But there is this sort of, we focus on legislation. That's what we do. We haven't got the distractions of constituency. There's other things we do around that, but holding the government to account legislation is what we do. And I sometimes get, there'll be different views on whether the current constitution of the House of Lords is right. I think there's big change to be made in the appointments and certainly in the size and those kinds of issues. But I think we do understand that our role is scrutiny legislation. But I think we've stopped valuing scrutiny as an objective in Parliament. And I think MPs and peers are a bit at fault. I think the media is also at fault. If we take two examples, if we look at when we had the Brexit debate, whatever your individual views on the issue, it was a toxic debate. Yeah. And if you said, I suppose there were people who said, people have spoken, there's been a result on the referendum, that's it, just got to do it. You had those that say, well, that's the principle, what's the detail of this? And those that said, well, we shouldn't be doing it, we'll have another referendum, it wasn't big enough. That middle group that was saying we've got to scrutinise, look at the detail, the abuse that we got in the press, and enemies of the people, dinosaurs in the Lords, and yet what we were doing was scrutinising legislation, but because of the unique significance of that piece of legislation, it became quite toxic. I was doing a TV programme recently, the Daily Politics Live, and there was a Conservative MP, though you would agree with me rather than the MP, so it's not necessarily a political point. And the point was made, how's the government going to get all its legislation through? And when there's so much of it and you're running out of time. And the answer was, well, it's House of Lords takes too long. We do something in half a day and they take a week. And I said, well, that probably says more about the House of Commons than the House of Lords. And the answer was, we just get on with it. And I think that's the problem. There's an impatience in government to get legislation through. And I think ministers have lost the ability in the Lords to have the authority to say, I'm taking this back, which when I first went in 2010 when I lost, you were able to do. The other problem, I think, has been the pandemic, where we worked remotely a lot. And that creates, I think, a transactional way of working rather than a deliberative way of working. So I think all those things are repairable, and I think Parliament has to take responsibility for constitutional scrutiny, but we're not doing it as well as we should. And again, another plug, that's why the review is so timely.
Excellent, thank you. Lord Wallace, you've been in the House of Lords for some time and witnessed some of the trends that we've been talking about. Obviously, the position of the Liberal Democrats is in favour of House of Lords reform and a democratic mandate. So to what extent do you think it's legitimate that the government or the House of Commons might push back against some of the changes that have been made in the House of Lords in the absence of a democratic mandate? Or do you think that that's an essential role until that reform takes place?
I mean, the argument that the Lords is democratically illegitimate is rolled out every time the Lords makes some powerful criticism of particular bills that the government wants to get through. Yes, the House of Lords is democratically illegitimate, but actually in the last 20 years we've come to see our role as we're the House that examines legislation. The Commons has almost given up detailed scrutiny of government bills. I'm struck that I look at the report stage, I'm third reading in the Commons, and that takes sometimes 3 or 4 hours. Yesterday we had, was it the 7th day of report on the Levelling Up Bill?
With 7 votes.
and 7 votes, with a lot of really detailed stuff. So if you ask, what do the Lords think our role is now, it is above all, we're the House that picks up badly drafted bills, and there have been some astonishingly badly drafted bills coming in recently, and tries to improve them and to make reasoned arguments back to ministers and to the Commons. And as you probably know, if you're really nerdish about legislation, when government amendments are introduced which change the terms of the bill to meet the arguments to be made by the opposition, that's working in practice. Of course, the Lords is indefensible, but so is the Commons in its current form. If you look at the number of people who are attached to the government, I was being told the other day of a trade envoy who'd been dismissed for voting against the government. So the patronage has spread even more than before with all these government advisors and so on. The Commons does not do a proper job. And if you ask, what does the Lords do about its constitutional role, let me just take 2 examples. The Elections Bill, which was removing the independence of the Election Commission and refusing the recommendations of the Committee on Standards of Public Life on Political Finance, and extending the franchise quite substantially to overseas voters who'd been abroad. There were some really large issues there that we tried to push, and which the government pushed back against, and which, I have to say, Angela, on the second round of ping-pong, the Labour peers went home in large numbers and we lost it.
Second round of ping-pong,
Okay.
we tried to fit 3 times by that point.
And if I take the second one, which is the SI question, which is actually deeply constitutional, we've been having more and more skeleton bills. On the procurement bill, for example, there is a section which says strategic objectives. And under that, the next clause says, the Secretary of State shall produce a paper which sets out the strategic objectives. So the strategic objectives are not spelled out on the face of the bill. And there's a great deal of that going through with secondary and tertiary legislation. And Lords committees chaired by crossbenchers or Conservatives have been making that point very strongly, and the government has not given way. So when we attempt to do our constitutional role, it's not welcomed. I sit in the Lords facing Chairman of the Committee on Standards and Public Life, a former Prime Ministerial Independent Advisor, Chairman of the House of Lords Appointment Committee, and on the Conservative benches, Chair of ACABA and a former Chair of ACABA, the Advisory Committee on Business Appointments. We have a lot of expertise, not to mention former Supreme Court judges, but it doesn't bite, and we don't yet have any way of making those constitutional issues bite.
Great, thank you. I mean, Hannah, one of the things we've heard from the panel is that the scrutiny in the House of Commons is perhaps not as good as it could be. To what extent do you think this is the dynamics of our kind of constitutional system, or to what extent do you think that there are powers that the House of Commons is lacking to be able to have those opportunities to better safeguard the Constitution?
So there's a lot in that question, Jess. I mean, I think the first question, point which people might raise is, is it the job of the House of Commons to safeguard the Constitution? And I think, as with every institution within our Constitution, they all have that responsibility. They all have the responsibility to think about their own role and how they're interacting with other parts of the Constitution. The panel's talked a lot about legislation, and obviously constitutional change often happens through legislation. But the thing, and we make recommendations in our final report about how that could be done more carefully, I think, by the House of Commons. I think the other sort of aspect which we've not touched on so much, but is really critical within sort of, if you're asking about the role of the Commons in safeguarding the Constitution, is, of course, the way in which politics plays out within the House of Commons. We've seen in recent years the processes within the House of Commons lead to real political consequences for people for acts in relation to the Constitution, so the Privileges Committee inquiry being one very clear example of Parliament taking a view on what it saw as inappropriate behaviour by Boris Johnson, and that having political consequences for him. And of course, Parliament, the House of Commons, is the sort of crucible in which politics plays out, in which party MPs decide, on the fate of their leaders and their members. So I think, there are different views on the extent to which the recent years have shown our constitution working, because when things questions have been raised, there has been an ability of the constitution to respond. But I think that what we're trying to get at in this final report is that actually we can't necessarily just rely on norms and precedent to make sure this always happens. I think we've been a bit too close to the line in some of these situations, and we think that when you're thinking about, in particularly like proactive constitutional change, arguably the House of Commons needs a more robust process to almost force MPs to really think through the sort of constitutional consequences of any changes that are being proposed.
Thank you. David, I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. I mean, over the recent period, particularly over the Brexit process, we've seen some legislation that some might consider to be testing constitutional boundaries. I'm thinking here around some of the proposals on the Northern Ireland Protocol, which would potentially contravene international law, and also the UK Internal Market Act, which raised a lot of concerns amongst the devolved governments, passed the House of Commons quite quickly and with not a huge amount of opposition. How well do you think, what's the role in political parties, I suppose, in that? And are there things, should perhaps MPs be more independent-minded when it comes to these constitutional questions?
I think there's a real challenge. I think, well, constitutional questions is one thing. I think actually one of the problems that we've got at the moment is the MPs not looking at constitutional or national matters at all, because what Angela talked about, the experience of working remotely during the pandemic, coupled with social media and the decline of local newspapers and broadcasting, means that MPs are positioning themselves increasingly, whether left or right, as local champions, and starting to believe their own propaganda, that they will get elected on the basis of how effective they are. They're not because of whether they have a blue, red or orange rosette on them. And I think there's a genuine problem, I think, for governments of any party there, and also for the focus on national and constitutional roles. I mean, political parties, they have a role, but I frankly think the answer lies in reform of procedures within Parliament. I'm completely with Hannah in believing that the good chap theory of checks and balances has now been tested to destruction. I don't think it's just the experience of the Johnson government, but I think that has demonstrated the case overwhelmingly. And you can point to the Internal Markets Act. I think the Internal Markets Act, I actually think there's an argument, because there was not, I remember looking at this whole question, there was not clarity about when we left the EU as to where, given the Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland Act, the powers should ultimately lie, given the existence of the UK single market. But of 150 plus areas of policy coming back from Brussels to go to the UK, we when I was Chancellor of the Duchy, we got agreement with the devolved on all but 4 of those on how they should be managed. There's a lot that can be done on devolution by looking at the structures of Whitehall, having proper consultation, framework agreements and so on. But it's not just Johnson. I think one of the things I do think needs to change is government control over closure motions. Closure motions are the tool by which governments, particularly with large majorities, limit the ability of the House of Commons to debate and amend legislation. And I can remember when I was new MP, so back just after Angela came in, it was the Freedom of Information Bill that came in. It was before the curtailing of late sittings. And I remember Jack Straw, who was Home Secretary then, at 2 o'clock in the morning, on his feet at report stage, answering detailed amendments from senior people on his own benches and on mine, because that was the convention, it's a seriously important issue at report stage. The Secretary of State personally would take charge of answering this, and the debate ran on for as long as was necessary. Now, I'm not in favour of filibusters. I'm not in favour of sitting till 3 or 4 in the morning with most backbenchers utterly bored sitting in the bar.
Or having disappeared.
Or having disappeared. Well, it's easier on the opposition side than on the government. I wouldn't go back to that, but we've lost that safety valve of time being available where there's a genuinely important legislative issue to be debated. So personally, I would give the power over programme motions to a backbench business committee or a backbench procedure committee, whatever you want to call it. So the government could make its case. I think ultimately the government have the power to override a committee's recommendation, but it shouldn't be something just the government puts forward, and only the government puts forward, which is the case at the moment, where for programming limitations on debate, which is too often used to crowd out at report and committee, particularly at report, any debate about an amendment that the government finds embarrassing because it might provoke rebellion on its own benches. And I would also insist that all legislation, unless it is genuinely of an emergency character, in which case you probably have to have some post-legislative scrutiny at an early date or sunset clause, but almost all legislation, I believe, should be subject to draft legislation, which should be scrutinised by a special select committee with evidence being taken, witnesses interrogated, before you even start on the first reading of the formal legislative process. I think that allows you to spot deficiencies in the bills. It encourages team working across party lines in that special select committee structure. And it also means you'll get better quality legislation at the end of the day with the pause for thought sort of built into that process.
Yep.
Thanks, David. And pre-legislative scrutiny is one of our recommendations that we make in our paper on the legislative process that was published earlier in this course of this review. We'll come on to kind of specific parliamentary reforms in a minute, but I just want to kind of zoom out a bit again. And I'm interested in what you were saying, David, about the local link sometimes preventing MPs from considering the systems as a whole. And I wanted to talk a bit about that in the context of proposed reforms to the House of Lords. The Gordon Brown Review recommended an assembly of nations and regions, which would tie members of the second chamber to a sort of specific regional or national area, which is not currently the case. I'd be interested, Angela, in what you thought the implications of that might be for scrutiny, whether it might change the role that the second chamber currently performs if there is a sort of local aspect to that.
It could do. Once you have a geographical representation, your focus has to turn to those who elect you and that geography. So I think that's a sort of a matter of fact. Though Gordon's report also looked at saying that the second chamber, whatever you call it, should have a greater responsibility for the constitutional legislation. Where he gets into difficulty on that is how do you define constitutional legislation and what is it? And I think there's sort of a whole range of things that are obvious and there's grey areas. I think that's a difficulty. So I think for MPs, I'm kinder to MPs. I think I feel a bit sorry I'm glad I'm not an MP anymore in many ways. But I think the pressures on MPs are enormous.
That is true.
And MPs don't not do proper scrutiny because they're not interested. Yep. They're just trying, other things crowd it out too often. And it gets very difficult. And as we've seen, I think, in part of the report, it looks at how much time the House of Commons spends on scrutiny of legislation compared with the House of Lords. And the Lords, which does still sometimes sit till 2 a.m, I don't recommend it as a good way of doing legislation. But we sit longer and later, and it's been a great proportion of our time in legislation. And one of the things was backbench business, which of course if you're having more backbench business, that's great for backbenchers. I can have a debate about my constituency, I can raise this issue, it's important to me, but what you're not doing is holding the government to account. So what looks like a really important parliamentary reform to give more power to backbenchers actually probably gave more power to the government. I think this whole area is quite difficult for MPs and peers. It's somewhat easier that, although we haven't got geographical representations, we do come from all over the country, and people bring that as in more of their skills and their geography to it. But can I pick up on David's point about how you do scrutiny? And I think there's a danger, and I think we do have to embed something, the Peter Hennessy thing, which is good chaps, which I always wince at slightly, with the good chaps theory of government. Is it dead, or can it be revived? And I think the jury's still out. I'd like to think it can be revived. I'm not convinced. But do you have to bring in mechanisms? There's a danger of looking for structural answers to political problems. So coalition government in 2015, there were two issues. One, how do we ensure the coalition survives and we have stability in government? And we ended up with the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, which wasn't scrutinised as well as it should be, and it didn't last very long after that at all. And then we had English votes for English laws. And I went back yesterday and today and looked at the debate we had in the House of Lords. It was introduced. How that was brought in, and that's quite a significant constitutional change. It was 22 pages of amendments to the standing orders of the House of Commons, which had 2 days of debate, one in July and then one in September when they had a series of votes. Now, that was significant. No one could tell us, and I would just become leader of the Labour group in the House of Lords, no one gave us any indication of how it would impact on how we looked at legislation, what were the implications. We couldn't get any answers. So there is, I think that you do need to have some kind of mechanisms to ensure we do it better, but I also think there's got to be a cultural shift in what we expect of our politicians in both houses as well. It can't just be, oh, we've got those rules, because people then find ways of changing them, breaking them, working around them. It's got to be, I think, a mechanism and a cultural shift. But if you make, and it is a really difficult issue about how you have an effective second chamber, I must admit, I'm more interested in what it does. I think we focus a lot in terms of reform on who's there, and I'm not sure we've got the current system right, and there's things we should do, but the powers are largely defined if people stick within the rules, but that is going to be, I think, a crucial thing, and you can't change one house without having an impact on the other, so we have to look at both houses as a whole parliament approach.
Yeah. Lord Wallace, I wanted to bring you in here to get your views on whether you think reform of the House of Lords would improve scrutiny because the Lords might have more of a mandate, or whether actually changes to the form might interrupt that delicate balance that makes the Lords very good at what it does at the moment.
Gosh, let me just make one passing remark on the underlying principles here. I've been very struck since the referendum that which was fought on the restoration of parliamentary sovereignty. That what we then found was the ministers and Boris Johnson, above all, arguing popular sovereignty against parliamentary sovereignty. Yes. And actually what we were having was executive sovereignty. The government says what it's going to do and shut up Parliament. So we are very confused about some very fundamental principles. And if we were to re-establish parliamentary sovereignty, then changing the way the House of Commons operates, having control of its own business, etc., would be a very important part of that. In terms of Lords reform, yes, I mean, when I was appointed, I rather hoped that I'd been in for 5 or 10 years and then I stand for election in Yorkshire. It's actually one of the things that I think little appreciated about the House of Lords is some of the most useful people in the Lords are those who are former leaders of local councils. Because they know how politics operates on the ground. And I work very closely with I've known Judith Blake for years before she came to the Commons, for example. I've worked with Lord Patel and with various Conservatives from Yorkshire because there are Yorkshire issues. So there's a bit of regionalism around, and I think it would certainly help to prevent the progressive dismantling of English local government, which has been going on in the last 15 years, if we had regional representation in the Lords. Having been the minister who was detailed off to try to take Lord's reform through in 2011 to 12. And it was a very painful experience, which was blocked by the Commons. I think actually reforming the Commons comes first, and the two will then go together. I think we should not spend too much time discussing the detail of the next stage of House of Lords reform. We need to do something about the Commons first.
So on to the Commons, Hannah, one of the arguments that some people make is that in order to improve scrutiny in the House of Commons, the best way to do that would be to change the electoral system, because it would prevent the government having these large majorities, which it's able to easily pass legislation. It would empower Parliament in this way. Now, this is one of the questions that we looked at the review. We looked at the constitutional consequences of electoral reform rather than necessarily advocating for or against. But how do you think that electoral reform would affect the dynamics in Parliament, and could it potentially be an answer to some of the problems that we've raised?
So I think, as you say, we didn't look at the desirability of electoral reform, but rather at what its consequences would be for the Constitution. I think the answer is you can't be entirely certain. If you look at other constitutional systems, they've been set up on the assumption that PR would lead to more coalitions, greater need for parties to negotiate their programme for government, but it's not always turned out that way. You get a whole variety of different outcomes from a more proportional way of electing your politicians, and sometimes that's a minority government, sometimes that's a coalition, sometimes it's a majority. But as you say, it makes it less likely that you get one party with a large majority, and I think that would change the way in which the House of Commons has to operate. There are some obvious things about how you would have to have mechanisms to achieve sort of consensus. You'd have to think about the time available to different parties to speak, places on select committees, those sorts of things. You might want to change the chamber if you didn't have such an oppositional setup.
Yes.
But I think the most important question would be how, if you did electoral reform, it changed parliamentary culture, to go back to the point that Angela was talking about, and that is slightly unknowable. And I think if you look at the example of New Zealand, you can see it's sort of evolved over time there. But I think one of the conclusions I drew from the piece of work we did on this is that actually you don't necessarily have, and some people advocate electoral reform and others are less keen, but there are actually changes which might happen as a consequence of electoral reform, which could also happen in the absence of electoral reform. So I think very much in agreement with the panel that we need to reflect on how both houses work, and there might be some changes that are desirable, whether or not you go for a big bang look at the electoral system.
Thank you. One of the things that we've already discussed is some of the kind of various pulls on MPs' time and the kind of constraints they're under. I also wondered how much you felt that MPs were not necessarily empowered with the information or the understanding that they needed to talk about the Constitution and to potentially challenge actors on the Constitution. It's one of the themes in our final report. David, I'd be interested in your views on that.
I don't think there's any shortage of information if people have the time and inclination to seek it out. I do think that the induction of new MPs can be improved. It's a lot better now than it was when I was elected, when you were basically told to explore the building in your first 2 weeks, and if you got lost, ask a policeman. It was it really was that basic. And and when the bell rang, you had to be in the voting lobby within sort of 6 minutes. And it was a famous occasion when Sebco didn't quite make it. I do think that courses offer some module on when people are first elected on the constitutional role of Parliament, and how parliamentary procedure works. Actually, to tell MPs that you need to, that the clerks are there to advise any MP. And actually, my experience, having done 13 years in opposition, sort of on the front bench or as PPS to the then leader, the clerks quite enjoy helping sort of insurrectionist backbenchers and opposition MPs to find a way to make life difficult for the government of the day. Because, they're sort of they say, well, if you want to, yes, that's what you want to achieve. Well, you think about doing it this way. So the opportunities are there, and perhaps the signposts need to be better, I think, is how I would put it.
Fantastic. And Hannah, obviously, the IFG has an academy programme looking for training for ministers. From that experience, what do you think it's essential that new MPs who might be joining after the next election know and understand about the political system?
Well, as you say, yes, we've long done training with ministers to help them understand their role and how government works and how they can be more effective. But I also think that, I feel really sorry for people joining Parliament given the complexity of how it works, but also the fact that the odds of sort of forming an independent view of what their role could be and what they can make of it are sort of rather stymied by the whips, who have quite a strong interest in controlling what it is that MPs think of as their role and how they ought to operate. And so I think, what we've seen in the last few years are quite a lot of bad habits, essentially, established on the side of government, but also the expectations that MPs, a third of whom have joined the House of Commons since 2017, have of what their role is. And actually, I think it is quite important that we all think about how to establish sort of good habits at the start of a Parliament and, as has already been referred to, what expectations are of the sort of role that MPs should be able to play in the scrutiny of legislation and so on. I think it is important that MPs get that sort of input and advice on that.
Well, there's also, Hannah, there's been a shift in expectations of MPs as regards government. I mean, and it happens gradually because there's not a complete switch over, new generation every election. But I remember when I talked to people who were my seniors when I was newly elected, who were in Parliament in the 60s, 70s, they would say that there were lots of MPs on both Conservative and Labour parties who had no expectation of going to Parliament in order to be ministers. They were there to represent their constituency, which they might visit as often as once a month, not always that frequently. There's a cup in, I think it's Maidstone Town Hall, which was presented to the then member, to some MPs back, to mark his annual visit to the constituency. And I do remember one senior MP, when I was in the Commons, saying to me, of course, what I do with my constituency post is put it all unopened in my locker. And then every few months I clear out the locker and throw it away. He said, it's astonishing how most problems vanish if you leave them long enough. And there were sort of Tory squires and Labour trade unionists who didn't expect to be ministers, but they support the government, but they were also prepared to go to the whips and say, look, we're not going to put up with this.
But you and I did that as well.
We did that, yeah, we did do that. And I think there's more reluctance to do that nowadays than there once was.
There is an issue, the route to becoming an MP. When I became an MP, I was 38 years old, and I was in the youngest 10-15% of MPs. I've had people now say, well, I'm coming up for 40. Someone said I'm too old to stand for Parliament for the first time. So you've got fewer people who've had careers outside Parliament coming in, and that affects your confidence and how you act and what you do. I think it's also who your mentors are. And I had people like Robin Cook and Jack Straw who'd been in Parliament a long time, and you learnt from them, and they were good examples for you on it. And just an anecdote, I remember when Jack was Home Secretary, I was attached to the Home Office as a PPS, and John Bercow had put down a question, and we were reforming the probation service, and the question he had in the order paper to come up at oral questions was, what is the new name of the probation service going to be? Because there had been some interest in anagrams, shall we say, and acronyms in the paper of what it could be. And the answer had been prepared for Jack, which gave no decision has yet been taken, blah, 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 blah. And he said, but we do know what it's going to be. It's going to be, grandly named, the Probation Service of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. He said, so I'll give the answer. So he crossed out the civil servants draft and went to the House, and he said, an MP has asked me the question, basically, and I will give a truthful, honest answer, because we have made the decision. Yeah. Now, I wonder if that would happen now.
Yeah, I do wonder.
And I genuinely don't know, but it was this case and a lesson to me. It mattered what happens in Parliament. You've got to be straight and you've got to be honest about it. And I just think things have changed a little bit in that regard.
I used to send, when I was a minister, I used to send back drafts to written answers, which dodged the question. Because I think this is perhaps to indicate the civil servants would do it because they thought that's what ministers wanted of them, which was if there was an answer that it would be embarrassing to the government to give, you sidestep it, you ignore the question, answer something slightly different. And that was just the wrong way to do it.
If we have time at the end, I'll tell you another one, but wrong questions now.
Great. I think Lord Wallace wants to come in and then we'll go to the questions.
There's a problem with political recruitment. And what I think we're seeing now, and Michael Cook is doing his best to follow it, is the centralisation of the selection of candidates in both major parties. And I read various comments on it. People in CCHQ and elsewhere are saying, what we want is people who are potentially good ministers and not all these idiotic local representatives, which is, of course, contradicts the way they have to behave when they get in. But that raises large questions about democratic choice.
Yeah, I mean, there's
and can I just add, the other problem is that patronage has expanded. The number of PPSs has grown, and then there are always trade envoys and others, so that the expectations of getting somewhere nice, if you behave well, thus obeying the whips, have grown, and the expectation that actually being chair of a select committee is the most important thing to be in life has not competed with that enough yet, since the select committee is extremely important. So I think any new government should make it a priority to cut the number of PPSs and probably cut the number of junior ministers as well.
Put a few more ministers in the Lords.
Okay, great. I want to make sure there's plenty of time for questions. If you're watching online, please do submit your questions by Slido, but I'll start by taking some in the room. Yes, we're going to take them in groups of threes and then we'll answer. We've got Tom, Alan, and then there's a lady at the back there as well.
Tom Brake from Unlock Democracy. A lot of the problems stem from poor primary legislation. And I'm just wondering what could be done to make sure that governments produce primary legislation that doesn't have the level of flaws in it that I think David Lidington and others have referred to.
Hi, Alan Rennick from the UCL Constitution Unit over here. Several of you have suggested that it's a problem that MPs spend so much time on constituency work. So what practically would it be possible to do? Can you change the incentive structures in some way to address that?
Yep, good question.
And just over there.
Hi, Hattie Simpson, A-level student. Considering scrutiny within the House of Commons, PMQs is one of the most public-facing areas of scrutiny, yet in recent decades we've seen it become little more than political point scoring. How do we consider reform of one of these most public-facing areas of parliamentary debate?
Great question. So 3 questions there. One on the poor quality of primary legislation, another on should we change the incentive structures for MPs on constituency work? Can we change that? And one on PMQs and whether that is still a useful scrutiny function. I'll start with Hannah, and then if we go around the panel this way.
So I think I'll take one and let other people address others. I'll take your question, Tom, on legislation, seeing we produced a paper on this in the review. I mean, I think we have definitely got into a situation where there's a lot of performative legislation which isn't necessarily intended even to achieve anything or may not even be commenced, but the point is to look busy and to look like you're doing something. But another problem we've had is legislation being introduced when it's not ready, essentially, because, again, there's a wish to be seen to be doing something. So the recommendations we've made in our paper are about increasing the level of scrutiny, which I think would act as an incentive to Secretaries of State to know what they're doing before they bring a bill in. We talk about expanding pre-legislative scrutiny, so having the expectation of pre-legislative scrutiny, which I think is something that any new government coming in at the start of a parliamentary term needs to think really carefully about the balance of what they have ready to go and what would actually really benefit from a deeper level of scrutiny, which has the benefit of upping the level of expertise within the House of Commons to think about the issues that are within a bill, as well as giving the government opportunity to reflect on a piece of legislation before they introduce it properly as a bill. Of course, the government might see that as a disadvantage because they have a whole set of MPs who are up to speed on the issues before they bring in their bill, but actually The ideal is that it means that technical issues and big questions get sort of resolved before the legislative process starts. But we also talk about how you can harness the expertise of select committees in the legislative scrutiny process. And we think there ought to be something called a select committee stage, whereby a select committee that has expertise in the area that a bill covers can sort of trigger and say, actually, before you get into line-by-line scrutiny after second reading, we would like the time, please, to either just do a single evidence session or perhaps a couple of evidence sessions and a little report to inform the House and to take a view on this piece of legislation. So we're not saying, as some parliaments do, that you combine select committees and legislative committees, because I think there are some real downsides to doing that. But I think, and it would need to be used sparingly in order not to gum up the whole system. But where select committees really felt that there were some substantial policy issues that they wanted to get into, they could call for that. And then that would mean that, as I say, Secretaries of State might need to think more carefully before they introduce a bill to make sure it really represents what they want to do, so that they can then defend that in that process and have that interaction with Parliament. Now, saying all this, it feels a long way from where we are now. But actually, I think, we, as I've said more generally, I think we really are due a reset in terms of the legislative process. We've had some very, what I would think of as a former parliamentary clerk, as bad practice in terms of the speed of which governments got used to being able to legislate. And I think that's really bad for all of us in terms of the quality of the legislation that ends up in the statute book.
On constituency work, I think part of the problem is the decline of local government and how many of the things that used to be dealt with by local government are now dealt with from the centre. And if Michael Gove is here for much longer, everything will be dealt with from the centre. So that people go to their MP. And since there are many, many fewer local councillors, people don't know their local councillors the way they did a generation ago. So that's one issue there. On quality of legislation, I think the speed of ministerial turnover has affected what's been happening. Clearly, the legislative process agreeing within Whitehall has broken down. There have been occasions on which, one particular occasion on the National Security Bill, when the Home Office introduced an entire extra part to the National Security Bill at committee stage in the Commons, which very strong rumour had it had not been cleared with some other key departments in Whitehall. I mean, that tells you that government isn't working well at all, and probably some civil servants have got quite demoralised by it.
I'm going to do quick fire answers. Look at Patty. On the PMQs, if I'm honest, I think that ship sailed. It's never really been scrutiny. It used to be twice a week for 15 minutes to occasions. Tony Blair changed it to once a week. Perhaps the way around it is to have more coverage, perhaps even two channels, one for the Commons and one from the Lords, not the sort of, you put the Lords on after the Commons have gone home, to see what's really happening in Parliament. People are interested, but I think the ship has sailed. It's now, I think it's theatre, if I'm honest. I don't watch it very often anymore, which is don't tell Keir. On the primary ledge, I think Hannah has got the spot on, but I think also the questions government asked, do we need legislation to do this? Is this the way to do it? I think, is the policy objective clear? And if we've got things wrong, are we willing to change? Give ministers the authority to listen to the Commons or the Lords, and if they think something should change, go back to the Secretary of State and says, we can do this differently. But that seems to be, once it's published, that's it, we can't change anything. And there have been two examples in the Lords where things haven't been through the Commons, in both the Public Order Bill and in the Levelling Up Bill, where there have just been new chunks introduced at a late stage in the House of Lords, which is ridiculous, had no proper scrutiny at all. And just Alan, I think on the constituents, I think, right, some people go to their MP as the first point of call now, before anything. And part of that, I'm struggling with a local council at the moment, trying to get an answer out of somebody. It gets frustrating. Oh, my MP will reply to me. And people do that. And I think it's actually getting back to for MPs to say your constituency work, your casework isn't an end in itself. That you obviously want to help people, but it is a way to inform what you do in Parliament, and try and get that message over might be helpful.
David.
I mean, on legislation, I agree with what others have said. It's partly, I think, pre-legislative scrutiny, as I mentioned earlier. I think post-legislative scrutiny is underestimated. Select committees are supposed to do that, but too often it's not sexy enough. I mean, perhaps you need a clause in every bill to say that the Secretary of State shall, after, let us say, 3 years, present a report to Parliament on how the bill has worked out in practice, and Parliament needs to find occasions then to scrutinise that and debate that. One could make more use of sunset clauses, particularly for secondary legislation, for statutory instruments, I think, with the possibility of just renewing them by a vote, if that's, but then you introduce a check where you go back and see, has this legislation done any good? Or is actually being useless or even damaging altogether? And I think
or not even implemented.
Or not even implemented, yes, absolutely. And William was right in talking about, I think what we've seen recently has been a failure of breakdown in governance. It's about political culture. I mean, when I was leader of the House, Theresa May said to me that the PBL, the Public Business and Legislation Committee, which I chaired, needed to be the toughest committee for any minister to go through, because ministers had to come in without officials to propose that they should be given permission to bring a bill in. And you test them on Henry VIII clauses, you test them on whether where are the points of controversy with the opposition, with people on the government backbenches, with local government, have you thought through the devolved implications of this? And, we were pretty tough. Amber Rudd is a very good friend of mine, gave a really hard time in a session, and she said to me after, David, that's the most brutal treatment I've ever had from any parliamentary colleagues. And another minister, I won't name, but wanted to bring in a transport bill to cover autonomous vehicles, electric vehicles, aviation reform, and the regulation of rickshaws in London. This bill was going to be about 250 clauses.
Sounds like the levelling up bill.
Basically, that minister was sent away with a bit of a flea in his ear and was allowed to have a cut down version of it. So the various things to be used there. Alan, I think, I agree with what others said. I mean, give local government proper powers again, including revenue raising powers, and the Treasury under any national government is going to be very resistant to that, but I think that's the way one has to go. I also think that if you adopt, whether it's at the select committee stage that William talked about, or pre-legislative scrutiny as a matter of routine for all bills, MPs are going to have to spend time on those bills. If you look at parliaments that work, I think, better than the House of Commons, like the Bundestag, European Parliament, now there's heresy for you, it's because every member sits on one or more committees, and most of the time of the members of those houses is taken up on committee work, and the committee work really matters. So it's partly by insisting that these other things are meaty and interesting and important that you get people off obsessing about emails. The bane of my life was people who booked 15 minutes to complain to me about their parking ticket. I became more and more convinced the traffic warden usually got it completely right. And Cathy, I'm a bit with Angela on this. I mean, I did PMQs when Theresa May was absent, probably 4 or 5 times. And I always likened it to it's the closest thing to going into the boxing ring that I'm ever likely to do in my life. It's a test of it's a test of resilience, it's a test of authority. It's a test of authority of both the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition, I think, because it's the only time of the week that the chamber is entirely packed and the press gallery is entirely packed. The press gallery normally is thinly populated and packs up at tea time anyway. So the mood amongst MPs, what they then talk about when the journalist rings them up, reflects their verdict on their leader at PMQs and feeds through their press coverage, so it's self-reinforcing. But I think we could make more of the liaison committee appearances. They probably should be more frequent, and the Prime Minister shouldn't be allowed to keep rescheduling them. The liaison committee, I think, is getting better over time at actually coordinating this, rather than it being a series of showboating outings for each select committee chair in turn. But that, it seems to me, is the tool for holding a Prime Minister to account.
Great, thanks. I think we've got a chance for perhaps 2 more questions if we keep answers brief. So over there and over here as well.
Hi, I'm Gareth Williams. I support the work of the Independent Constitutional Commission in Wales, but I'm speaking very much on my own behalf, not on behalf of them. I just wanted to come back to your report, really, but I think members of the panel have an interest in it. So you said that the new Constitution Committee should be permanent, but clearly your report is very much founded on not challenging parliamentary sovereignty. So, which in practice, I think, as we've talked about, is effectively the sovereignty of the Commons post the Parliament Act. So what if a new government comes in and legislates to put in place the Constitution Committee and indeed the list of constitutional statutes, what would prevent the next government from simply repealing that legislation by simple majority?
Great. We'll get the next question.
So there was a comment made earlier about how the recruitment of MPs now is more focused on, people who are going to become ministers and sort of becoming more centralised rather than, people who may just, want to serve a certain regional interest. Do we think this is something that is, more of a permanent trajectory that sort of is snowballing and can't be stopped? And if so, how do we handle that? Or is it something that is maybe a function of, current political incentives at the time and could potentially be reversed? And is that the desirable end, sort of?
Great, thank you. A couple of questions there. One on some of our recommendations, which I'll let Hannah take, but happy to come in on as well, and another on political recruitment. So if we start with you, Hannah.
Thanks, Gareth. So we don't see this being a statutory committee. So we see this, as you rightly observe, being, potentially it would be subject to parliamentary sovereignty. It could be undone. Our hope, and of course, we would always like to already be at the point where, you can see in the distance the possibility of being, and you have to start somewhere. Our hope is that this becomes a sort of committee like the PAC, where, it's not something that's readily undoable because of the sort of the quality and the fixed quality of its work and the fixed sort of point it becomes within the constitutional process. I think having an external body, as we've described, like the PAC-NAO relationship, will help give it authority and give it a sense of permanence. But I think the other analogy we were thinking about, and Jess mentioned this in her presentation in the first session, is with the Committee on Standards in Public Life, where which was set up by John Major at a time when there was sort of a lot of consensus about a problem which needed to be addressed. That was the sort of cross-party sense. And the first work that it did was to establish those Nolan principles, which then gained traction across the public sector. And really then it built its work from that foundation. And that's why we have this idea of this committee's, one of its first tasks being to try to articulate some of these constitutional principles on which we think our constitution is built, and then sort of to go from there in terms of its work. So we have these different analogies in mind for what we hope this committee could do. But you are absolutely right that at the end of the day, a government that decided it was inconvenient could, under the model we propose, still get rid of it.
Fantastic. And on political recruitment, Angela, did you want to comment on that?
I think this is something that comes up ever since I've been a member of the Labour Party, which is a very long time. And it's, if you are a representative at national level of your political party, you're not just got a local audience, you are a national spokesperson. So political parties, all political parties, have some degree of authorisation for candidates who stand for them at national level. And I don't think there's any political party that doesn't do that. But at the end of the day, the choice is local people. So I think it's a two-stage thing. But I don't recall a single general election where somebody who's disappointed or somebody who hasn't got onto a shortlist in a particular area, somebody hasn't been endorsed by their national party, has been upset about it. But I think it's a balance. If you're a member of a political party, you want to represent at national level, you accept the national rules and the policies that you feed into. You're not just a local representative. So I don't think it's quite as dogmatic or as authoritarian as some people would have it, but there has to be a basis of which somebody stands as a candidate for a political party.
Well, Wallace, did you want to come in quickly?
Just happily on that, I wonder whether in some ways, parties, because they're becoming much more efficient, are also becoming more centralised. I was very struck the other week in the Yorkshire Post story that the North Yorkshire Conservatives are complaining desperately they have been abandoned by the National Party because it's expecting them to raise their own money for the election of their local mayor. Now, I thought that local association was supposed to raise money, and if the Conservatives in North Yorkshire can't raise enough money for a campaign, I wonder what's happening. But of course, the National Party now has huge amounts of money, which it does send down, and that alters the relationship. So I worry about the extent to which central and local tensions within parties are going. Just a rapid comment on joint committees. How the committee is appointed and how its chair is appointed is clearly extremely important. I'm conscious of the argument that Boris Johnson had about the composition and chair of the Intelligence and Security Committee. We're going to have to think very hard how this committee is appointed, maintained, how it's...
And just very briefly, I'll give you the final word.
Gareth, as Hannah said, you can't stop a future Parliament legislating for change, but you can make the political cost of that heavier by what you put in place. I think that in terms of MPs, there's a problem which William's comments sort of took us towards, that local political party memberships are shrinking. That there are not mass parties. Yep. Now, Labour had a big boost at one stage. Conservatives have tried different things to try and get more people to join locally. None of them have worked. These are not the sort of organisations they were back in the 1950s. So they tend to be more narrowly based politically. And also by law now, you have to have, if you're a candidate, you want to describe yourself as Conservative or Labour, because of the rules on funding, you have to have an approval from the party centrally so that the accounts are all in order. But I think the deterrent to getting really good quality people to put themselves forward for Parliament are not to do with centre local. I think it's to do with the increasingly uncivil and polarised notion of politics. When I was leader of the House, it was just after Joe Cox had been murdered. So many MPs started to unburden themselves, particularly, but not just women, and MPs of ethnic minorities about the stuff they got. I saw the anti-Semitic material that had been sent to Luciana Burge. I saw some of the racist stuff sent to Diane Abbott. Cheryl Gillan told me about the stalker that she'd been contending with for years. Tobias Elwood told me about the death threats and the man who turned up with a sword at the House of Commons asking to see him. When David Amess was murdered, MPs and candidates and potential candidates' families throughout the country, left, right and centre, would all have been saying to the man or woman concerned, what the hell do you want to get into this for? Add into that the degrees, not threats, but just unpleasant scrutiny. Social media has reinvented the 18th century mob in a virtual form. Yes. And I'm afraid that I now find it more difficult. I still encourage people, young men and women, if they ask me to go in, but it's much more an on balance recommendation, and be aware if you do go in, grow a thick skin, because you're going to need it even more than my generation needed to do. And if we can't get to grips with that, then we're not going to get good people. Good people are being put off at present.
Fantastic. I think a really important note to end on there. So thank you, David. That's all we have time for, I'm afraid. I'd just like to thank my excellent panel. If you could all stay seated, we're going to go straight into the next panel, which is what will the general election mean for the UK Constitution? But before that, if you could just join me in thanking our panel.